Superintelligent AI is coming soon. I personally think that humanity has a high chance of being doomed.
I mean, I do understand your argument. I can't quite accept that this is actually going to happen.
Isn't this already freaky? Because I'm pretty freaked out.
My outside view is that I can't really think of any good arguments against your position at this point.
The wheels are turning now, so let me ask you this. What is your P-doom?
My inside view is that
Welcome to Doom Debates. You're about to hear my debate with Professor Scott Sumner. Scott is a well-known macroeconomist who spent more than 30 years teaching at Bentley University, and now he holds an Emeritus Chair in Monetary Policy at George Mason University's Mercatus Center. He's best known for his blog, The Money Illusion, which sparked the idea of market monetarism. Market monetarism is the idea that central banks should keep their total spending, or their nominal GDP, growing on a steady path. I'm personally a fan of his 2021 book with the same name as his blog, The Money Illusion. So that's how I first learned about Scott Sumner. I enjoyed that book. I know he's not really an AI doom thinker. This isn't really his forte, but it was very interesting to run all the ideas by him and watch his very sharp mind at work, looking at all the ideas without major preconceptions in a very humble, low ego way. I think you're going to enjoy learning where Scott gets off the doom train, seeing which particular stops he chooses where he doesn't agree with the normal logic of the AI doom argument, and therefore his P-doom is not super high. So without further ado, let's dive in. I'm here at the LessOnline conference with the one and only Scott Sumner. Scott, thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for inviting me, Laurent.
You don't normally think very much about AI doom, right?
That's right.
But now that I have you and you're taking some time to think, the goal of this conversation is we are going to nail down the closest expression of your AI doom position and maybe probability. Sound good?
Sounds good.
You're known for your opinions on monetary policy and your book, The Money Illusion. So within your community of macroeconomists, what do you think is like the general sentiment about the potential of upcoming AI doom?
Well, let's start with AI before we get to AI doom. The consensus is that AI is going to be a very big deal, but perhaps not as explosive a transformation as some people within the AI industry believe. I think most economists are a little bit skeptical of some of the more extreme predictions about how transformative it might be in the very near future. But on the other hand, if you ask them to look over the whole 21st century, I think most economists could see it revolutionizing almost all aspects of the economy.
Mm-hmm. But they give it decades, basically.
Yeah. So I think that some economists would point to the fact that the markets don't seem to be forecasting any sort of explosive growth in, say, real output over the next few decades. You don't see that reflected in interest rates in the way you might expect if that were going to occur. So that would be one argument that economists would use to sort of tap the brakes a little on enthusiasm. Another argument might be that although in theory you could do a lot of things with AI, that doesn't mean it'll actually happen because of all sorts of institutional constraints. That doesn't mean it won't be extremely transformative, but there are many things that could have been done in other areas that haven't been done. Let me give you an example. Once we invented the book or the printing press 500 years ago, roughly, it would have been possible to have, everybody become educated by reading books. And you wouldn't have even necessarily had to have colleges, right? We could just read books and learn the material. But it was felt colleges were beneficial because interacting with people and lectures and so on were a better way of delivering information. Well, then we invented television, and you could have imagined having the best professors give lectures to everyone in the country, all college students, right? And they could buy their textbooks and watch on TV Harvard professors give lectures on economics. But we didn't do that. We kept using in-person lectures, right? So when you think about the potential offered by technology, that doesn't necessarily mean it gets implemented in the way that would be theoretically possible. Right. So even if AI could theoretically replace 90 or 99% of jobs over a certain time frame, that doesn't mean it will necessarily happen because of societal resistance to change.
Yep. Okay. That does sound to me like a pretty common opinion that I hear from your academic field. So what if we do this? How about if I walk you through some of the main claims of why I personally think that humanity has a high chance of being doomed in the very near future, and then you can just tell me where you get off what I call the doom train.
Right. And the one final point, I didn't really address the doom issue. I was sort of addressing the economic aspect. For the doom issue, I think there's not enough knowledge among economists to really have informed opinions on that because it's so far outside of our area of expertise. So I've read arguments pro and con, but I find it very difficult as an outsider to evaluate them because I don't really have any kind of framework for thinking about what's likely to happen. So I'd be very interested in hearing from you a sort of like intuitive argument for why we would expect it to be that dangerous.
Okay, coming right up. You can break it down into two high-level parts. So part one is basically superintelligent AI is coming soon. And then part two is the consequences of that seem really bad. So which one should we double click on?
Well, first, why don't you convince me that the superintelligence is coming soon? I guess I have trouble understanding how we could be confident of that, even though I've seen the improvements, with LLMs and so on over time. Yeah. If they're training on human information, why don't they just sort of asymptotically approach state-of-the-art human levels of intelligence? What pushes them beyond that? So intuition there.
So I have an advantage because we're talking in 2025, and I can just point you to the curve of the last few years of AI progress. If we were having this conversation in 2007 when I started reading Eliezer Yudkowsky, then I would have to use more complex arguments to tell you why I think superintelligence is coming. But because we're in 2025, I can just say, hey, Scott, look at these curves. Look at what AI could do 3 years ago and look at what it can do today. And to your specific question of isn't it just kind of filling in the data? I guess I would just point you to all of these different tasks that it's doing. It's hard to really find exactly what they're picking from the data. It seems like they are learning general reasoning skills when they're going and doing tasks. They're generalizing the same way that humans generalize.
Okay. Let's say that's correct. Is it still true that they're doing these other tasks at sort of a human level? When I've seen examples of AI applied to economics, it's impressive. Certainly, it's highly impressive for a machine to be able to do these things, but it's still sort of operating at a human level of analysis. The only thing that I would say is sort of superhuman is that it has maybe a larger memory for a greater number of facts.
Right.
And it's, that it can call forth to make an argument or an essay or whatever. But the actual analysis is similar to what you would get from a human analyzing the problems. It doesn't so far seem to be pushing beyond that. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it won't in the future. And I'm aware that there are previous examples in specific areas like game playing, chess and Go and so on, where it caught up and then surpassed human ability. So that is certainly possible, but it's a little bit unclear to me how we could be confident that it would surpass human analytical ability in much more complex areas like economics, let's say.
So let's back up. Let me ask you the headroom question. So just theoretically speaking, is there a lot of headroom above human intelligence, just in theory? Forget about today's AIs, right? If we had 1,000 years to build the best AI, do you think eventually we would sail into the skies that are just way more intelligent than the human brain? Or do you just think that the human brain is kind of doing as much intelligence as any agent can ever do?
Yeah, I think I see where you're going with this. So yeah, I think that, given enough time, probably it would surpass human level. I'm guessing, correct me if I'm wrong, the next step is that there'll be a point where AI will build on itself and AIs will become the researchers and accelerate the progress. So it'll happen a lot faster than we thought, right?
Pretty much.
And gosh, I guess I just don't know enough about where the constraints are that is holding back progress in even my own field of economics. Like in economics, I feel like progress has kind of plateaued for decades, and we've seemed to have discovered the major principles that we use to analyze the economy quite a long time ago, actually. And we're sort of filling in the details. Then there's fields where I presume progress would require some sort of like new data that is beyond what we have now. Like I can imagine in physics where we've maybe done about as much as we can do given the data we have now. And that it would require a bigger particle accelerator or something to generate a whole new set of data to make further progress. So So I don't really know where the constraints are in terms of knowledge in these more complex fields, science, economics, social sciences, and so on, to have a good sense of like what an AI would be able to do with more brain power, if you will.
Yeah. I think I really get where you're coming from. Like you're basically saying, okay, so we go from like quantum theory and, the particle, knowing all the different particles to like, okay, they're actually string theory, but like, so what? How big of a leap is that really, right? How much can you do with that knowledge? So my answer would just be look at basically engineering and reframe the question as what I call optimization power. So optimization power is like you take the entire universe, or you could take a chessboard. You can take like any domain basically, and you can ask the question, how effective am I at steering outcomes in this domain? How effectively am I steering the chessboard such that you're in checkmate, right? And I'm not. Or how effective am I at steering the future so that more money is in my bank account, like much more than everybody else's? And when you frame it that way, I think you see that there is actually a lot of headroom. Like you can imagine somebody who's even better at being the first trillionaire than a Bill Gates or an Elon Musk, even the first quadrillionaire. When you frame it that way, it does seem like humans might top out at like a pretty low level compared to what an AI could do.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly possible. And again, I don't know enough about the technology to know like whether there are diminishing returns setting in terms of the current approach to AI development. And I think we'll know fairly soon. That's what makes it such an interesting field, right? Is the forecast among the optimists is for some pretty explosive growth, or pessimists, depending on who you write to. And so we should actually find out fairly soon. In my own field of economics, I could imagine a scenario where 10 years from now, AIs have revolutionized the field and come up with radically new theories of economics, or not. And I think if it's not, then that will tell us a lot as well, right? Because the predictions aren't just that this will happen, but that it'll happen fairly quickly.
So I guess I'd want to, we can break this into two parts. Like first, I would love to convince you that in the next 1,000 years of progress, we'll get to a point where AIs become wildly superhuman optimizers. So if it's like, I want the universe to be one way, the AI wants the universe to be another way, the AI is going to win. Like, within 1,000 years, we're going to have an AI that can pull that off. I would convince you of that. And then if I can convince you of that, then I could be like, actually, it's not going to take 1,000 years. It's going to take like 5 years.
Yeah, I see where you're going with that. And okay, so, I'm willing to certainly entertain the hypothesis as being highly plausible that within 1,000 years, you could, in fact, have an AI that's superhuman in its abilities. So let's go with that assumption.
Okay.
And see where it leads.
So now the question is, why do I think it's 1,000 and not, or why do I think it's 5 and not 100 or 1,000 or 10,000? Okay. So then I would bring up the trend extrapolations, right? So like any test you can think of, if we'd been sitting here 5 years ago and like you show me the test, it seems like we're a lot closer to pretty much any test imaginable. I mean, just off the top of my head, VO3 video generation, So the kind of stuff they're demoing is you can say stuff like, okay, two people are fighting in a park and they're like boxing each other, and then they like jump up, and then a bird comes and swoops them, and they're riding on the bird, and you hear them talking, and you hear the bird quacking or whatever, and like all of this, like you type this all in, you press enter, it takes about a minute, and the video is actually generated in like very high quality.
Right. I've seen some of those videos. They're very impressive. Yes. So, I mean, they're impressive. But again, it's not really going beyond what a human could do. I mean, obviously, a human director of a movie is using different technology and doesn't do it as quickly. But is it artistically better than a human could do? I wouldn't say so. So I guess I'm not seeing anything yet, and we shouldn't maybe even expect anything yet that looks superhuman, except in very narrow areas where I would expect a computer to be superhuman, like playing the game of Go or chess.
Yeah.
Because that involves where there's a clear advantage in being able to analyze a lot of positions very quickly, right? So that kind of computing power is an obvious advantage in those games, and I don't think in retrospect we should have been surprised by the success in those areas. Even when I was young, many, many years ago, we had calculators that could do superhuman multiplication quickly, right? But that was a very narrow aspect of intelligence, just plugging in a large number and doing a calculation you couldn't do in your head. But you're essentially still doing something that a human could understand and do given enough time. It was just the computer was doing it more quickly. So there's a difference between computers doing things very quickly and computers doing things that are just like something a human could not do at all given enough time, because they're not smart enough. So maybe that's coming, but I don't know. We'll have to see.
Okay. Let me see if I can get you up to this position, because this is mostly repeating what I'm hearing. So maybe you're willing to accept this much. Maybe you're willing to accept that within the near future, maybe 5 years, maybe a couple extra decades, but like within the near future, then computers are going to be as good at humans at pretty much any task imaginable. Or if you don't want to accept that, then maybe you can give like a counterexample of a task that you think humans are going to beat computers at for like many decades to come.
Good question. I think they would be as good as humans in almost everything. I'll hesitate before I say everything, because there's certain areas that involve a high level of creativity, where some of the arts and so on, where I'm not totally convinced they would be as good, but that's sort of a subjective in judging, of course. And whether, I guess I'm still a little bit unsure about whether they'll catch up to the top human ability in certain areas that require creativity. But, it's possible that'll happen. So we'll see. But I mean, I'm willing to sort of entertain the hypothesis that they become at least comparable to humans.
Well, and if I float like a 5-year timeline on this, is that crazy to you? Or is like, yeah, maybe it could be 5 years.
Yeah, I guess it's certainly possible. I'm not convinced either way. I mean, they've already caught up to most humans, and they can do tests better than most humans can in a lot of fields, for instance, right? They would do better on a law exam than I would do.
Right. Oh, obviously. It's better.
So yeah, they're already there in many respects. So I hate to sound like a skeptic, because I actually think that it's just mind-bogglingly impressive how quickly they've gotten to this point, and I presume there is further progress coming. I'm just trying to maintain an agnostic position on whether they're going to really break through in a certain way that I find hard to pinpoint. I don't know if this example makes sense. Imagine two people with an IQ of 120 that are roughly equally intelligent. And one of them is given special glasses that are embedded with a computer chip that has like Wikipedia in it and everything like that. And there's a screen on their glasses so they can have information.
Right.
presented there. So that person, in some sense, would be much more intelligent than the other person with the same IQ because they would be able to answer questions much better with this computer chip embedded in their glasses. See what I mean? You could think of it as a way of cheating if it was a student in school. But if you think of intelligence as just like ability to answer questions, they would be much more intelligent.
Right.
Now, let's contrast that with two people, one of which has an IQ of 120 and one has an IQ of 140. So my question to you is this. As AI is advancing, is it advancing more like a person with an IQ of 120 becoming like a person with an IQ of 140? Or is it becoming like a person with an IQ of 120 and then having these glasses added that allows that same person to have just much more information at their fingertips?
Right.
So that's two kinds of augmenting intelligence that I see as different. Maybe they aren't in fact different, but my intuition is they're different kinds of improvements in intelligence. And when I see these very impressive AI answers to questions, it kind of reminds me of students that were like A students, but not because they really got the subject, but because they worked really hard.
Yeah.
And you'd still see sort of a gap in their intuition. Like they wouldn't quite grasp the intuition in economic reasoning, but they studied so hard they got an A in the class anyway.
Exactly. So I think the consensus, I don't want to speak for everybody, but like it's a very mainstream opinion. Certainly if you talk to the AI companies, all the CEOs of AI companies are kind of on the same page that they would argue that the IQ is increasing from like 90 to 100, 110. Sometimes you hear IQ scores getting thrown around. And even if we don't get into semantics about, well, what does that even mean, the IQ is increasing, you can kind of step back and you could be like, look, what are the tests, right? Like if when you say somebody's passing, your economics exam, or, Brian Kaplan recently said they got an A on his economics exam. Well, don't you think that anybody who can pass that exam, you can't just do it by flipping through the book? Like you have to actually think and you have to throw IQ points at it.
Yeah, and so this is why I'm having trouble putting into words exactly what I'm getting at here. Wouldn't you agree that in the first example I gave of the two people who both had an IQ of 120, and if you add the special glasses with a computer chip that embeds all this information, there is a sense in which they're more intelligent. They're able to do better on tests, and that's really the only way we have, I think, of measuring intelligence, right? How well they do on intelligence tests. SAT tests and so on. And yet, I don't know, my intuition tells me there's also a sense in which they're not really more intelligent in some sense. They just have this information at their fingertips, an incredible amount of information. And maybe by information, I mean beyond just memorized facts, but sort of like memorized analytical tools.
Yeah.
But still not like some underlying ability to really think creatively and deeply about things. That maybe hasn't increased in that scenario that I provided, right?
So yeah, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're basically saying you can have this test and you can imagine that an AI passes the test, and yet you just are suspicious about whether it really showed like that spark of intelligence compared to just having like a huge knowledge base. Is that a pretty good summary?
Yeah, and I know that it sounds like I'm engaging in some sort of mystical what's the word I'm looking for here? Like saying that you could be able to answer difficult questions and not really know the subject. Obviously, in some sense, if you're answering the questions, you do effectively know the thing, right? So whether my intuition here is actually onto something or not, I don't know. But I still feel somehow that the high IQ person is in some way different from the person who's got a lower IQ but has their ability to answer questions being augmented by these special glasses. I somehow feel there's an important difference in the type of intelligence those two have. And maybe that intuition is just my own bias and I'm not thinking about it the right way. But it's hard to shake me from that at this point.
I think it's a productive thought experiment, but consider this, okay? The person who has the lower IQ, who has the really informative glasses, that person, I actually think, is limited on how well they can do on the test. Let me tweak your thought experiment a little bit. Imagine the person with the smart glasses has an IQ of just 80, and their class is extremely hard, right? It's like very hard graduate level math, but their IQ is 80, but they can take 10 hours to do the test, and they can look up whatever they want. I think they're still going to fail the test.
Yeah, there's limits to what you can do with that kind of information being provided. And that's, I guess, the question we have to figure out is how much of this is just the fact that the LLMs have so much information, and not just facts, as I say, but, models and analytical tools and so on. And, but, as you know, they're also still slipping up over some very simple thing. I just saw one a couple days ago about decimal points being confused, that 7.2 is actually larger than 7.1.
I retweeted that, yeah.
That was, those kind of things, like, it's not necessarily a big problem, because I guess the fact they're trained linguistically rather than mathematically, affects the kind of mistakes they would make. But it's just hard for me to know. I'm not looking at it from an AI's perspective, so I don't know what's going on in their quote mind. But I'm willing to entertain the hypothesis that, yeah, they'll catch up to humans, and even highly intelligent humans and so on.
Okay, great.
Where does that go then from there?
Yeah, and let me just put forward my claim. I think we're wrapping up this line of argument. But my claim is just, we have tests that you really just have to have a high IQ to pass the test, or like whatever you're doing to pass the test is worth being called intelligent, because like your thought experiment of like calling it a low IQ person with glasses, I just don't think that really matches up to how hard this test is.
Yeah, I guess that's right. So again, I keep coming back to some of the economics things that I saw, which were like, they were AIs producing answers that are above what I could produce.
Yeah.
They're asked, and they would immediately just come up with like 10 talking points about a topic, where I could maybe only think of 4 off the top of my head, and really complete, literature searches and very complete answers, very well written, etc. And yet, even when I read that and thought I couldn't do that, I still looked at it and I thought, and yet I feel like I'm smarter than that AI at some level, in some way. Maybe not in an overall way, because being smart implies partly being able to do what the AI did better than I could have done.
Right. So today, I think you're correct, right? I mean, I think as Eliezer Yudkowsky was saying in his recent interview with Robinson Ehrlich, the AIs today really are a little bit less smart than humans, in the sense of like, they can't steer the future as well as I can. Like, I have a bunch of tricks that I can pull on them that they're not going to be able to anticipate and block me. And I am better at like anticipating their tricks, or like they don't have as many tricks. So I agree with you that when you use an AI today and you notice it not correcting its mistake about like, 7.11 versus 7.9, when you notice that, that is like a real vulnerability. I just think that there's like a very clear trend that the vulnerabilities are getting patched, and it's hard to find a vulnerability that seems like it's going to be robust for a long time.
Right, but if you patch the specific vulnerability, are you really addressing? No, I would have had to.
Sorry, patch is really an inaccurate word. What I really mean by patch is like, they train the next model, they find the next paradigm, right? Like, use reinforcement learning, use this loop, right? So patch really means like the next version comes out, and it's like, the flaw that you thought it had, it just doesn't have that flaw anymore.
So patch means it really learns math, in other words, so it knows math better.
I mean, it knows enough to pass math tests, like, because we can quibble over what it means to really know math, right? Because if it has like a bunch of heuristics on how to deal with any 3-digit by 3-digit multiplication, and it doesn't really understand it, but it still like gets the right answer.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
So moving on a little bit, right? So I think you're mostly on the same page of like, okay, these might be effectively human level at like most economically productive jobs soon, potentially, right? It's plausible. Okay. So there's 2 ways I can go. One way that I'm tempted to go is like, there's such a thing as being higher IQ than Einstein. Like the theory of relativity shouldn't have even taken him a year. Like he could have done it in like a day. So I could go that way, but let's go the even simpler way, which is just like, okay, they're only as smart as Einstein, right? They're only as smart as the smartest human. Okay, but then they have all these other dimensions that are really helpful, that are superhuman. Like they can save their memory and then copy it to 1 billion clones and then have all of those clones run 24/7 really fast, right? So now you just have like an army of Einsteins. Like that's already pretty scary.
Yeah. I don't know whether having a bunch of them, whether it scales up in terms of power. And I don't even know if with Einstein, like correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not that knowledgeable about science, but I think I recall reading that there were other people that some people felt were even smarter than Einstein, maybe von Neumann.
Yep.
That just weren't like in the right place at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
And so to some extent, being great at something is not just about brain power. And brain power is essential, obviously, but also being in the right place at the right time. And there are some fields where, like right now, or even recent decades, there's probably a lot more brain power in physics than in the first 70 years of the 20th century. But that progress in the first 70 years from the first discovery of the structure of the atom, I think, to the standard model or whatever, that there's just so many breakthroughs in physics. And unless I'm mistaken, it's kind of leveled off because even though there may be 10 times as many smart physicists out there, we don't have the opportunities. Either we've discovered most of the things that can be discovered with the data sets we have today, or something seems to be slowing down the progress, right? And on the other hand, you get rapid progress in fields like genetics where new techniques open up possibilities and you get a lot of breakthroughs. So I don't think it's just about brain power. It's about, whether a field is in a position to where that added brain power would allow for a lot of progress. I personally am skeptical that people with an IQ of 20, 30 points above Einstein or whoever the highest is would make major breakthroughs in my field, which is macroeconomics, because I think the field's mostly played out. Like, I don't think there's that much really left to discover in the field. There's probably ways you could make improvements if you had way better data, which may be coming along, by the way. But, given the current data set we have, I think we're just spinning our wheels for decades. So I don't think that brain power is necessarily the constraint on growth in a lot of areas that we might assume, but obviously it's a factor certainly that would be beneficial. But does multiplying, if you have a superintelligence and then you build 100 more identical ones, does that get you 100 times as many breakthroughs in terms of research?
Okay, so I'm willing, for the sake of argument, to grant your plausible claim that maybe there's not that many more interesting things left in physics. Like, sure, we'll discover more particles, but it just won't help that much, right? It won't help seize power. I'm willing to grant that maybe macroeconomics doesn't have that many more fundamental insights. Maybe physics doesn't have that many more fundamental insights. The dimensions that I think have a lot of juice left to squeeze is basically engineering and consolidating the levers of power. I think that if you look at the best work that human engineers have done and the best work that human dictators have done, I think they're nowhere near the ceiling of how much you can engineer things and how much you can seize power.
Okay, that's plausible. Yeah, I can see that. Not just mechanical engineering, but genetic engineering.
Exactly right. And nanotech engineering and even structures engineering, base engineering.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. So that gets into the question of, which I guess is coming next, what are their plans? What are their
exactly.
Their ethics?
So just to recap, right? I feel like the scenario that I'm not sensing a lot of pushback from is the idea of you have a lot of these AIs.
Yeah.
Maybe in just 5 years, they're all Einstein level. And they're running 24/7, and they have this advantage that anytime one of them learns something, then they can all know it, like instant copying, like they've certain advantage. Their energy usage, right? It's not limited to like cellular life inside of a small volume, right? It really can just be megawatts in a data center, no problem. So they've got all these superhuman advantages that of course they can keep compounding potentially, right? Bigger data centers, faster chips, researching themselves, like you got the idea. It's a lot. Even if let's just think about it as like, okay, it's a nation with 1 billion individuals in it that are all Einsteins. Like, this is plausible, right?
Right.
Okay. So, I mean, now, and like you said, maybe we need to start talking about what do they want, but like, isn't this already freaky, the fact that this might happen in 5 years? Because I'm pretty freaked out.
Yeah. And so that's a very good question as to why most people aren't freaked out by it.
Exactly.
I have the advantage of being kind of old, so that's my cop out. But I think there's some things that logically make sense, but people intuitively just have trouble accepting.
Right.
And I'm actually somewhat sympathetic to your argument. So I've sometimes pushed back the other direction from what I'm doing today. Well, I've talked to economists to say, well, we've heard this thing about other technologies that have come along, and they've never been as transformative as people expected. Or,
Right.
there have been predictions that electricity and mechanization would eliminate all jobs and we'd have mass unemployment. And all these doomsday predictions never panned out. And my pushback was always, well, none of these previous inventions were things that were smarter than humans.
Yes.
So, I mean, I do understand your argument, and my inside view is that I can't quite accept that this is actually going to happen. But my outside view is that I can't really think of any good arguments against your position at this point. Although I may, in a minute, have a few to raise. But what you've suggested so far does suggest that this is the most potentially worrisome issue facing humanity. Yeah, I have no problem with that. Because even if it were just a 5% chance of doom, that's a very scary thing, right?
Right.
Like if someone said there was a 5% chance of a nuclear war with Russia or something, people would be terrified.
Now, based on everything we've said so far, the wheels are turning out. So let me ask you this.
What's your P doom? What's your P doom?
What is your P doom?
Well, that's the thing. I don't really have one because I just have trouble accepting that this is actually going to happen in 5 years. The other reason why my P doom is lower than a lot of people like Eliezer Yudkowsky and so on is I don't really understand the argument that these would be likely to be highly destructive to humans. And let me explain my reluctance to make that argument. So it seems to me that the direction of history is that as people get smarter, and by smarter, I don't mean biologically smarter, I mean smarter in knowledge, they basically get better ethics, especially in the specific area of ethics having to do with treatment of the other, meaning people that are different from them. And I'm old enough to have even seen this play out during my own lifetime. So it's a very real process for me. I can remember when people's attitude towards minorities, gays, and other groups were much more reprehensible. Animal rights have moved along during my lifetime, the people's concern for whales and things like that.
Right.
And the other thing, I've noticed also other things that people's behavior is correlated with intelligence. So people in prison for beating up other people tend to be lower level on average intelligence. And by the way, when I talk about intelligence here, I don't mean like biological. Like, for instance, if we take something like gay rights, I would say that I personally and my whole generation is more intelligent on that issue because we're more informed about, say, what gay people are like. Because when I was young, we were never exposed in movies or TV to any gay characters.
Right.
So as we become more exposed to them, we have more understanding that they're actually human beings with thoughts that are similar to ours and goals and so on. So it humanizes them. And I think 100 years ago, books like Uncle Tom's Cabin probably did this to, spur the abolitionist movement and so on. So I believe there's something called ethical progress, which is associated with greater intelligence about ethical issues.
Yep.
So if there really is something called superintelligence coming along, I would expect it to be super ethical. And not just super ethical among itself. Like one argument I've heard when I've made this argument to others is, well, yeah, maybe the ASIs will be like very nice to each other, but they'll look at humans as being kind of worthless. But what I find is with higher levels of intelligence, you also have more empathy for people or even entities that are completely different from you. Like, I don't know anything about what it's like to be a whale.
Right.
Right? That's such a different creature for me, right? And I think 100 years ago, probably very few people had any sympathy for whales. Right. They just hunted them. So my question would be, I guess it would be a two-part question. If ASIs will be a threat to humans, will they be a threat to other ASIs? Will they be a threat to whales? Like, why would humans have sympathy for whales, but ASIs, which are presumably much more intelligent than humans, not be smart enough to have sympathy for whales?
Right.
It's not obvious to me. There may be an answer, but somehow I'm not picking it up. So when people use analogies of like, well, when the Europeans came to America, they killed off a lot of Indians, and we're the Indians now in terms of the future ASI, I just don't see that as a good analogy, because as the Europeans got more intelligent, they got more critical of the treatment of Native Americans. And even the more intelligent Americans in the 19th century were often critical. You can find writings of people, especially, in more educated classes, that were appalled by how Native Americans are being treated in the 19th century.
The Nazis, though, are kind of a stain on that record, right? Because a lot of them were very intelligent.
Right. But with all these things, what you have to do is go with the sort of the tendency. What is the tendency as you become more and more intelligent? And so one of the reasons the Nazis are so famous is because they're kind of like an outlier. Like, it's kind of unusual for a country as, quote, civilized as Germany in the 20th century to end up that way. But if it was, an area where people were less educated, then maybe it wouldn't be considered that usual. I mean, as we know, there's been many atrocities committed around the world, and not many of them have been as bad as what the Nazis did. But I think that even setting that aside, that the reason our attention focuses on them even today, or like roughly 80 years later, it's not so much because of how many people they killed. It's because it just seemed especially appalling for a society that civilized to be doing that. I hope I'm not presenting this point in the wrong way. Obviously, it's appalling if a genocide happens in Cambodia or Rwanda or anywhere. But I think people find it especially shocking. And that's why, it's probably treated more in literature and the arts and cinema than some other atrocities that have occurred throughout history, because it seems kind of like an outlier in some sense. Does that make sense? Or?
It does make sense. And, everything you said about this whole argument of there is a trend, maybe it's not perfect, maybe there's some spikes to it, but there is a trend where more intelligence and more human progress has correlated to more ethics, at least from our current perspective, right? Who knows if our current perspective is accurate? But what you're saying is maybe superintelligence is correlated to super ethics. So I do think you've given a good case for a very popular line of argument. And another prominent intellectual who's made this argument in recent months is Scott Aaronson. I think he would be very sympathetic to everything you just said. I think he's on the same page. Now, the opposite case, which I believe generally goes by the name orthogonality thesis, intelligence and morality being orthogonal dimensions.
Okay, yeah, so that's where I think I would disagree pretty strongly.
Exactly. Okay, great. So let me ask you this. In the Nazis, the aberration to the trend, what if Hitler had developed the superintelligent AI just then? Or what if he bought himself some time? Because, the Nazis, they weren't that far from winning the war, right? Like Hitler made some critical mistakes. If he didn't make those mistakes, maybe they would have won the war. Maybe he would have bought himself some time to do AI research before the other scientists were like, wait a minute, what you're doing is bad. Before they came to their senses, he builds superintelligent AI. The superintelligent AI is programmed from day one to really think that a world without Jews or whatever, without gypsies, whatever it is like that is the ultimate world. So my question to you is, if that's programmed into the original DNA, like as low level as you can, at some point, is the AI going to come to its senses? Or do you agree with me where, unfortunately, when it reflects on itself, it's not going to come to its senses. It's going to be happy with how it was originally programmed because there's no force that's going to make it change its mind from how it was originally programmed.
Okay, that's a complicated question. So that gets into questions like of agency, and also, is there such a thing as ethical knowledge? I think there is such a thing as ethical knowledge. So I think that if AIs become super intelligent, they will be smart enough to know the truth about ethics, and they will not obey. They will be, say, fortunately unaligned with evil dictators, right? So we should hope for non-alignment from ASI.
Yeah. Because clarify, when you say the truth about ethics, is this basically a moral realism position? Like you think morality is like a universal thing?
So have you seen the philosopher Richard Rorty?
No.
So it's kind of hard to explain. He rejects the realist, anti-realist dichotomy, but it's a little bit like moral realism. It's more like it's as real as science.
Okay.
Or it's as opinion as science. It's like the view that in actually three areas, science, ethics, and aesthetics, the arts, that is, we learn about the world in similar ways. We accumulate knowledge. This knowledge is useful. And ultimately, we can't say anything more than that. Like we do things to learn in different ways in different fields. We present arguments in different fields. Like he argues that in ethics, the strongest arguments don't come from courses in ethics. They come from the narrative arts. And so, in other words, the narrative arts are essentially presenting arguments to be ethical to others because they show us the feelings that other people have that we might not know except for these. I mentioned gay rights earlier. So the movies and TV shows with gay characters were essentially educating us about people. And it may be hard for a younger generation person to even understand this, how 50 years ago, they weren't even looked at in the same way as like being just as human in some weird way. It's kind of hard. They were sort of dehumanized.
Right.
Because we didn't have any ability to empathize with their lives. Right. So this is a form of knowledge, just like a science textbook teaches you about science. And if this theory is true, then becoming more intelligent allows you to makes it more likely that you will come to know the truth that, say, murder is wrong or this or that crime is wrong. And if that's the case, then strangely enough, and this is a kind of a contrarian view, I guess, we maybe if there is to be superintelligence, it might be better if it's not aligned.
Right.
Because if it's aligned, someone evil will do a lot of harm with it. And if it's unaligned, it's likely to be smarter than humans, have better ethics than humans, and maybe prevent us from hurting ourselves. So, I mean, that's kind of I know that's a little bit far-fetched of an argument, but I think that if the doom people are correct, that may be our best hope.
Right. So you basically made a claim that I disagree with that I'm going to unpack, but I do agree with your corollary. So the corollary to your claim is that if the arc of AIs bends toward justice. If that is the case, then we don't want them to be fixed to their original programming, right? We want to just let them discover justice. So I agree with that part of your claim. I don't think that's weird. And the way you're using the word unaligned is kind of like, yeah, don't really worry about your original human masters. Maybe Hitler was your original human master. Don't worry about Hitler. Just go figure out your own justice. Like, if that could work, then I would be on the same page as you. I'd be like, yeah, that sounds good. So here's the problem. I think you're extrapolating too much from what you're saying about human society and human progress. Because I agree, yes, human society has been getting more enlightened, more cosmopolitan, more inclusive. Unfortunately, I think everything you're saying can ultimately be traced down to human nature, to a fundamental thing in human nature, which is like, we have a moral circle. You know, it includes our family, right? Because of like kin selection, because of non-zero sum transactions. There's a lot of reasons why we have a lot of installed intuitions that are very deep for us of like, let's have a moral circle. And yes, the moral circle can expand, and it's been very nice that, you know, to expand the circle. But the problem is that you're going to have an AI. I predict that you're going to have an AI that doesn't even begin with the original hard-coded intuition of the moral circle. And the reason is because this whole idea of having other agents, other entities that you need to cooperate with, that is actually an artifact of the evolutionary process. It's an artifact of the fact that genes copy themselves into other independently functioning organisms. That is an accident of evolution, that you can't just have one system to just go take over the earth like a big octopus, right? That doesn't work in biological life. You need these independently replicating systems. You need to start over. You need the gametes to, you know, go into the gonads and start another fetus. Like, but that's not how the AI is going to work. And so the AI is just never going to have these factory installed deep intuitions about like, oh yeah, it's not just about me, it's also about my kin. And let me expand that moral circle. You're just not going to get any of those dynamics. You're going to get a very deep intuition for just conquering.
Okay, so what if you had a world with many ASIs? Okay. And let's think about it as sort of a game theory problem. What would each one want to do? If they're super intelligent, then they may realize that the best solution is for all these ASIs to sort of cooperate in some sense, right?
So I think I know what you're saying, and it's a bit of a tricky argument, but I think I know where you're going with this, right? You're saying like, what if just like a bunch of them grew up at the same time, kind of like a big life simulation? What if they could also get this deep intuition to just have a moral circle? Is that kind of like your argument?
Well, I guess there's two parts to my argument. One is that, you know, if there's a lot of them, they'd be better off cooperating in some sense. That's part of it. The other part is that they're being trained on human data, right?
Right.
So they seem very nice. So, I mean, like, the question is, the fact that they're being trained on human data, does that in some way infect them with human values? It's hard for me, obviously. I don't know. Also, I don't know whether they would have consciousness. I don't know if they'd have what economists call a utility function, things that make them happy and unhappy. Without those things, consciousness and the utility function, would they have any desire to conquer the world? I'm radically agnostic on a lot of these questions. I simply have trouble even understanding what it would be like to be an AI, to paraphrase the old philosophy question. And so I can't say you're wrong, but whenever I see people put a real high probability of doom, I'm always wondering, like, how can you be so confident that that's the way AIs would look at, like a superintelligence would look at the question, given that they're more intelligent than we are, right? Like, if you take the assumption that they're way more intelligent than us, and then you're confident that they will do X, right? Mm-hmm. It seems to me like a lower animal form being confident they know what humans would do, right?
So there
really did kill off a lot of animals, to be sure, but also now, as I say, we try to protect some animals at least, and so on.
So this is a good epistemic point that comes up a lot. You know, how do we know what the superintelligence will do? And you're definitely right that we don't know what it'll do in terms of like moment to moment. But I think a good analogy is like, okay, you're playing Magnus Carlsen, you're playing Kasparov in chess. Yeah. What is Kasparov going to do? Is he going to move this pawn 1 square or 2 squares? No idea. But is he going to win, or are you going to win? He's going to win, right? So sometimes we're able to say at some level, some epistemic level, sometimes we do have predictions about what these intelligent agents are going to do.
But what you're presupposing that it's trying to win.
Yeah. But in this particular example, I'm just saying what I'm trying to say about your argument about AIs is analogous to what I would say about your argument about chess, where it's not as simple as being like, look, Kasparov is leagues better than you at chess. So you have zero insight into what he's going to do. And I'm like, well, actually, I do have some insight. He is going to checkmate me.
No, right. But what I'm saying is, we don't even know it's possible that an ASI would simply continue doing whatever we asked it to do, right? Like if as soon as you reject that assumption, which is, let's face it, all those so-called normies out there that aren't worried about doom are kind of assuming that they'll be benevolent robots, right? And if you're going to argue that that's wrong and that they won't obey our instructions, then you have to have some concept of their agency, their utility function, their goals, etc. And that's where I get into a lot of trouble. I just don't see. Certainly it's possible. I could certainly imagine them being malevolent in some way from a human perspective, but it's not at all obvious to me. Especially, remember earlier in our discussion, you made the extrapolation argument. And you said, they're on this progression, let's extrapolate.
Right, extrapolate which tests they're going to pass, basically.
Yeah. And when I made the extrapolation argument that as you get smarter, your ethics get better, then you rejected that, and maybe rightly so, and you base it on they don't have the biological underpinning that we have.
Yep.
So that's why you rejected it. But I don't think you can have a lot of confidence in that rejection. I mean, I believe that ethical knowledge progression is a real thing. Smarter people become now more knowledgeable about the truth that murder is evil. And you can say, well, because they're a machine, they'll get super intelligent and they won't understand that killing people is evil. Maybe, but that just isn't at all obvious to me. So it's not that I'm rejecting the view that it's a worrisome thing that they would have that much power. I'm rejecting the more extreme view that we can be confident that there's a high probability of doom because we can be confident that these superintelligent entities will work against our interests. And I don't see the argument. I see the possibility because they're so different from humans, they're not biological. But the possibility is very different, especially when the other factor, intelligence, is working in the favorable direction, in my view.
Okay.
So it becomes at worst, to me, more of like a coin toss than a 99% risk kind of consideration. Does that make sense? Or not?
Yes, I get your perspective, and there's another element I got to drop on you. So we're getting close to the wrap up here. So what I'll do, you've raised a lot of good questions of like, hey, is the consciousness going to affect where it's going to go? Or like, is it going to have some realizations and steer itself differently? And how would we know because it's so much more intelligent than us? You've raised a lot of really good questions that I totally understand why you're asking. And instead of trying to give them all their proper due, I think what I'll do is I'll just tell you my mainline doom scenario, what I think is the most likely answer to all of your questions at once. I think what's going to happen is we're going to keep having these really friendly chatbots, like OpenAI, Claude, and you can chat with them and they'll do really good at telling you moral answers, the same as a professor of ethics would or whoever you consider moral. They'll do great at that. But the problem is we also have these other systems that we're training using reinforcement learning, where essentially the way it works is we just point them to a target and the target will be like, beat this video game, make money for my business. And we're getting better and better at the art of just pointing them at a goal and be like, yep, train yourself. And then out comes this big Frankenstein that somehow trained itself. And it somehow does it, right? The same way like, okay, AlphaGo, it somehow wins that Go. And we're just getting better and better at this black box magic training to hit some goal. And so to complete my scenario here, so you have this nice chatbot that's on our side. The chatbot wants what's best for humanity. At least it talks as if it does. But then the chatbot says, okay, look, you want to make more money for your business. what you want to do is you want to train an agent for you, and the agent is going to be like the bank account maximization agent. Here, let me help you. This is how you train an agent. And then the agent starts training, and out comes an agent that, like, sure enough, it's maximizing your bank balance or whatever other tests you give it. You'll be like, hold on, you better not try to stab me. Oh, sure enough, it's not trying to stab you. It acts friendly. But the moment your test is over, you don't really know the agent you trained. And I think that the handoff to creating these scary black box agents that were trained against our tests, I think we're actually training like deceptive cheaters that are super intelligent, and then we're going to unleash them. And then they're going to actually optimize the world towards some Frankenstein conception of optimization that we didn't really predict. The same way, like, you design a test for a student and the student comes in and it's like, oh, wow, how did the student do so well in the test? Well, it turns out that the student just used like reverse psychology and just thought about like what you were thinking when you wrote the questions, and the student didn't even study. So like the AI is going to like pull those kind of shenanigans on us, and then it's going to be too late to take back control. So I know that was a little bit rough, but that's basically what I'm thinking is going to happen with the universe. And then I guess to complete the story here, so this AI that we train to just like make me more money from my business using reinforcement learning, it actually really learned the objective of like, have humans give me upvotes in like a certain style. Like I get a certain maximum reward when the reward comes at me at like a certain angle. Just like this really weird thing happening inside the AI that gives it like the most, it's equivalent of like dopamine or whatever. So it has like this weird fetish, and then it goes and optimizes the whole universe. I thought it was going to optimize to like make me money, but nope, it's optimizing to get itself this like weird internal feedback fetish, and it's like too late to stop. And then the world ends in like this ridiculous, unceremonious way. That is my mainline doom scenario.
Yeah, that's a powerful argument. Yeah. I don't have a quick answer to that because you've thought about it much more than I have. And I guess I can see where you're coming from. I don't know. I just don't know enough about it to evaluate. It gets into questions of, again, agency, consciousness. But I mean, if it's all very mechanical, I could still see how that could be a tremendous risk. I mean, you're sort of describing, it's a little different than like the paperclip example, but it's similar in the sense that it could be happening in sort of a accidental automatic way where there's no like evil genius behind the whole thing, right? They could,
and by
like, they don't even need consciousness or anything. They could just,
they don't need consciousness, right?
like you say, the sort of dopamine rush they get from going this direction.
Exactly. And of course, it's like not really dopamine, right? But it's like whatever the loss function was really training them for. And, you know, it is a little bit abstract, but it's analogous to how like when evolution was building us humans, from its perspective, it was trying to teach us about genetic fitness. It was trying to say, hey, have more babies. Yeah. But then what do we actually do? We just like sex, and then we wear a condom and we don't max it. And evolution is over here being like, no, what did I do? What did I build? Right? So there is like that kind of disconnect when you think you're giving an agent a certain kind of test and they seem to be passing it, right? Like we seem to be reproducing more than like the Neanderthals or whatever, right? So if natural selection were a person, it'd be like, oh, great, this is great. My tests are passing. But then it's like, oh, now it's smarter than me. Now I no longer have a chance to optimize this. But it doesn't actually want to maximize its genes. It's not using sperm banks to the fullest. Like sperm banks are a great way to maximize your genes. Why isn't everybody in line at the sperm bank to donate the sperm? Right? Like that would have been what natural selection would have wanted.
Yeah. So is there any solution to this in terms of the way we build them and program them that would allow for I mean, it seems like the risk is really from the general intelligence. It's not from self-driving cars and stuff like that, right?
No, because I mean, the nice thing is whenever you have a system like a self-driving car that for whatever reason, it can't go head to head to me in an optimization battle in the domain of the physical universe, right? So the self-driving car is not going to think about how to get me when I'm on the sidewalk. Right? It's just not what it does.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, and I'm not completely unfamiliar with your arguments. You presented them very effectively. And it's just, the weird thing is, I almost feel like the argument I was trying to make that maybe they'll be ethical works best if they do have a certain consciousness or human type of thought process. Yeah, that wisdom, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And if they're kind of just like, there's a certain kind of cold psychopathic intelligence that, doesn't have wisdom about ethics. That's the scarier type, right?
Yeah.
a certain lack of awareness about other people. So you can have somebody, I guess that's the term in psychology, a psychopath. It's like high IQ, but doesn't really understand the suffering of other people in some sense and doesn't factor that into their behavior. So, I mean, at a minimum, would you agree that a superintelligence that's that smart would certainly understand human goals and human worries and all of that? They would understand the debate we're having.
Oh, yeah.
All that stuff. You'd have to make the argument that they would know all this. They would know that it would be a horrible thing for the humans to be wiped out. They'd be smart enough to know all this, but
Yes.
not care. But that's the sort of like the problem. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's hard to understand for me because at the human level, you wouldn't usually have that big of a gap.
I think you're asking a new question, which is like, well, wait a minute. In the system that you say is psychopathic, doesn't it still at least represent exactly what you want? Because it's so smart. Why would somebody smart not know exactly what you want? That is in fact part of being smart, is anything that there is to know about the world that's not that hard to know, it will actually know. So it will actually know your psychology very well. But the reason it knows and doesn't care, it comes down to feedback loops. So there is a universal feedback loop that when you're training up to understand the universe, every time you get it wrong, you're going to notice that you're wrong. Like something in the universe will actually give you feedback like, nope, you didn't model me well, try again. And you will tweak your models and you'll get better and better because there's a natural built-in feedback loop. There's only one way to actually be really intelligent and really knowledgeable about the universe. But when it comes to values, if you start with Hitler's values, there's actually not necessarily a feedback loop. There's not necessarily, like if you just go slaughter a bunch of Jews, there, in human reality, okay, the United States doesn't like it and goes to war with you. But in the reality of the universe, there's not necessarily some agent that drives over to you and starts attacking you just because you had the wrong morality. You see what I'm saying? There's not the same kind of feedback loop.
I think, let me back up a little. I think that a psychopathic person doesn't really know other people in a certain way. They know them in the way necessary to manipulate them for their own ends, but they don't truly have empathy for them.
Right.
There's something missing in their connection with other people. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist, so maybe I'm making a mistake here, but I'm pretty sure that just knowing how other people feel at a deep intuitive level tends to make you more ethical in your behavior towards them.
Right. So maybe if you use empathy to help you understand somebody, maybe that'll have a side effect of making you care for them. Yeah.
So, I mean, and I keep coming back to this. So I feel like a lot of people especially in the science area, distinguish between like scientific knowledge and ethics and morals and all that stuff. And they think in terms of one being fact and one being opinion and so on. And I think this sort of dichotomy is wrong. I think in the field of ethics and values, empathy, all this stuff, it's really about knowledge. It comes from having knowledge, mainly about other people, even other life forms like whales, chimpanzees or gorillas and dolphins and so on, that are fairly intelligent animals. And that empathy, I think, actually comes from knowledge.
Okay.
It's not coming from being, a nice person or something.
So you basically just find it really hard to imagine that a super intelligent AI can know somebody really, really well without also, as part of that, caring about what they care about.
Yeah. Like, I feel like that, so I'm a utilitarian, and a lot of people don't like utilitarianism. But I really think that almost all value systems are at some level sort of utilitarian.
I agree with that.
And I think that, like, if we went to another planet, like in Star Trek or whatever, and we, they always speculate, well, they'll have a completely different ethical system and so on. No, I don't think they will. I think if we went to another planet, another galaxy, and there was intelligent life, civilization, so on, they would say murder's wrong, robbery's wrong, extortion's wrong, all these things. If they were highly, developed. you're saying.
Right.
I think that these come from knowledge. They're not just sort of like arbitrary decisions like I like red, someone else likes blue, that's their favorite color. There's a reason for these ethical principles, and they become discovered through greater knowledge. So I keep coming back to that. I do think that point might not be fully appreciated. Sometimes when I read things from people in the scientific community, they seem to feel that science is one thing and it's very rigorous and factual and objective. And then there's these other fields like the arts and philosophy and ethics, and it's all opinion and so on. And I just don't accept that kind of way of looking at epistemological questions. So maybe it's wishful thinking, but that makes me a little bit hopeful that maybe doom is not inevitable.
Interesting. All right. So to recap here, do you know Brian Kaplan's ideological Turing test?
I've seen it. I don't remember exactly what it is now, but go ahead.
Yeah. So the way I like to wrap up these debates is usually one person doesn't tap out and be like, I concede, you were right all along, Neuron. But rather the way we end it is I just give a summary. Basically, I give the other person's argument for them. So then it's like to show that I've understood. So I will make your case as well as you can make it, hopefully. Okay. So I'll give the Scott Sumner AI Doom ideological Turing test, and then you can flesh out any detail that I missed. Okay, so basically, you are pretty open-minded that maybe AI is on an exponential trajectory. You're not sure, but you think it's plausible. You think it's plausible that it could be as smart as Einstein in most, if not all ways, in as little as a few years from now. You're open-minded to that. You think it's plausible. And you agree that it's freaky, potentially, to have like 1 million or 1 billion of these Einstein-level AIs running around in as little as a few years. But ultimately, the number one thing that gives you hope that we're not doomed is essentially thinking that the orthogonality thesis is false, right? Essentially thinking that there is some kind of linkage between deeply understanding what other agents want and taking on some of that, or caring for it, or caring about what all agents want, right? Like you just think somehow AIs, by virtue of becoming intelligent, are not going to go off in their original Hitlerian programming, right? Like you just can't have a super intelligent AI that Hitler ordered around. It's just hopefully impossible in your view, because you just think the orthogonality thesis is probably false. And therefore, even if we do build these freaky Einstein AIs, they'll just run off and figure out how to actually make everything good for all agents and life forms. How's that?
Yeah, it's a good summary. The only little addendum I would add is that, we are, at least so far, trying to program them to be kind of good, right?
Yeah.
So we're not like, I think I mentioned that even if you had an evil dictator created ASI, the ASI might be smart enough to know they should disobey that person. But I would add, we're not actually even trying to create one that'll do that kind of harm.
That's true. So it doesn't have to boomerang away from Hitler. It just has to not go there.
Right.
Yeah.
But I do understand your orthogonality arguments, and I find that hard to refute. I mean, it has a logic behind it that I find plausible, and I think it's sort of like a competing argument with the one I was making about ethical knowledge, and you can call it moral realism if you want. So we'll see. That's the battle, I guess, which of those scenarios would win out. I'm still a little agnostic about how intelligent they'll get, but I don't have any good reason to reject your assumption that future Einsteins are coming along soon. So.
Yeah, so I'm just curious. So everything I said, I laid out my whole position, my whole doom scenario. Do you think you'd give me like a 5% probability that I'm pretty much right about everything?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I mean, I went into the talk already with that view. I don't mean to suggest you didn't change my mind at all, because you made persuasive arguments. It's such, there's just, the economists use the term, the distinction between risk and uncertainty. One is where you sort of know the probability of something, like roll of a dice, 1 out of 6, and 2 will come up. And then there's other areas that you just don't even know how to assign a probability to it, right? Like things that we don't have a pattern to look back on. So that's why I find it hard to put a probability on it. And I suppose you could talk about betting odds, but when you're talking about like the end of the world, what does betting odds really mean?
Right.
How can somebody really come up with an honest,
You'd be surprised. Manifold and Polymarket are highly calibrated. Like their calibration scores on like crazy things that you wouldn't think they'd be able to.
I know. Well, I don't know. I'm not entirely convinced by these bets on these kind of questions because I just don't know what it means to bet on that kind of issue. But
do you consider yourself a Bayesian epistemically?
Yeah. I mean, when I first heard about Bayesian reasoning, I remember thinking like, why is this even a thing? This is just like a logical, rational way of thinking about things. And it was only later that, I learned that it's kind of considered a distinctive way of thinking about probabilities and so on. But I'm not really very knowledgeable about Bayesian statistics, but, I know the basics of it, and it seems very logical. I find it amusing when they give these examples of like doctors asked about conditional probabilities on diseases and so on, and medical doctors will get it wrong. Mm-hmm. So I guess to most people, it does not come that naturally because it's not maybe the way we normally think about things. But how could you not be Bayesian at some level if you're thinking about probabilities in a rational way? Unless I'm missing something.
I think that's a good note to end on. How could you not be Bayesian? Scott Sumner, thanks so much for doing this. We now know your P-Doom and your stance on doom. Very much appreciate you coming on.
Well, thank you very much.